Hi everyone, what's up? My name is Lidobi and I am the host of the Power to the Flower podcast. Welcome back. We are at season 2, y'all. We're gonna have some great guests this season. We're gonna be talking about some really fun, important topics, of course. I think that right now it may be a good thing for the cannabis industry to not go through legalization. Do you think that Donald Trump with his DEI rollbacks even cares about putting social equity at the forefront of cannabis policy? No. They care about business first. The people at the top right now, the people in government are business oriented individuals. They're white. Again, no tea, no shade, but it's the motherfucking truth. So if you're looking at it on that perspective, you know for a fact that cannabis policy will not be centered on Black or brown lives and reparations. And that's important because that tells you a lot where their interests lie ahead of the people. And this administration obviously cares a lot about crazy ass conservative shit. Number 47 is also number 45. Donald Trump has come back with a vengeance. He came back heavy handed on the policies, heavy handed on the executive orders. And one of the first executive orders that he ever signed was the anti DEI executive order. Let me tell you something about this individual against diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think Donald Trump has led the parade of folks who don't really understand why we even had this or don't care to understand why we had diversity, equity, and inclusion in the first place. Statistically speaking, and I'm sure y'all have heard this by now, the majority of the beneficiaries of DEI initiatives were mostly white women anyway. As you can imagine, diversity, equity, and inclusion just means all marginalized groups in one category, allowing them to have a sort of like an equal footing because they haven't had so historically in the past. However, we need and we demand for these companies and our government and all of these different places to be more equitable and to enforce more opportunities under DEI initiatives that previously, even companies, though that they had that blurb saying that they supported all diversity, equity, and inclusion, they no longer really cared to do that as much until we really were pressing them to do so. And when they finally did, and some companies decided to do it performatively, they were still called out by one side, and that was the conservative side, for not being fair to them, not being fair in providing opportunities for white men. This administration will not be here forever, just like the last administration clearly was not there forever, but the concern is about what can happen to our government if it is continued to be pushed and tested beyond its limits and its structure of government and the standard itself, right? The structure of government as it is right now, right? We have an executive branch, a legislative branch, a judicial branch, and with the executive branch kind of pulling and calling a lot of the shots, the judicial branch allowing for the executive branch to get away with certain things. And I say that because of the highest court of the law allowing Donald Trump or any president, any sitting president, to sort of commit a crime and not be penalized for it or go and serve jail. Like, it's crazy. I'm telling you these things that have happened in our government that we may not even realize what the consequences are until after the fact. But now we're seeing a lot of these consequences. A lot of these consequences have to do with the fact that if we are not active participants, we, the people, if we ourselves are not active participants in trying to make sure that our government doesn't go awry, if we are not active participants in making sure that there's equity, if you do not stand for rights in general, your rights will be likely taken away at some point too. So here's what we do know about the Republicans and their approach to cannabis legalization. Congress, both in a bipartisan stance, Republicans and Democrats do agree that cannabis should be legal. However, the reason why there hasn't been reform on this is because a lot of the Republicans that do agree with cannabis legalization are really more in favor of just allowing the states to do what thy wilt, okay? They would rather just see states that have decided to legalize have their own sort of hands-on approach to how the states want to distribute resources, how the states choose to criminalize, and even better, more so, those states then distribute a lot of that power back to the municipalities in a more direct way. So it really is more of a hands-off approach with Republicans. They're more just interested in seeing how the federal government doesn't necessarily have to address criminalization. So those who are in favor of states just doing their own thing are more in favor of the states who have legalized to do their own thing as opposed to states who haven't. That way, it sort of serves as a happy medium for those states that don't want to legalize, having to deal with this whole now federal change or approach to the way that they conduct legalization or cannabis policies in their state, if they do at all. What it doesn't do is that the Republicans are not addressing the past harms that were done to communities of color, or those areas that have been disproportionately impacted by criminalizing policies. That is where Democrats have really thrived with cannabis policy, is that there have been folks like Cory Booker, for example, a United States Senator, introducing legislation that is more focused on criminal justice reforms and allowing not only cannabis to be legal, but to also address past harms. And that is not going to happen under this administration for multiple reasons. But first, let's start off with Republicans just do not agree. Republicans are not in favor of any sort of social reforms that would give any particular community, let alone just people of color, right? The ability to now fund because of past harms. So Republicans don't want to go there. As a matter of fact, there have been Republican led efforts to go against those types of social equity reforms, not just within the United States government, but then also in those states that have legalized. Cannabis has been built off of the backs of Blacks and brown people, but specifically Black people in the United States of America. And even when it was hemp that was a commonly used plant to be able to do different types of things, build cars, make paper, etc. That was even built and cultivated by Black farmers, people in the South, and those in other places who could produce. But this is not something that Republicans are willing to at all welcome. Social equity or the dismantling of past harms is not being properly addressed. With that being said, back in August of 2024, Donald Trump was actually on the campaign trail and said really great things about possibly making sure that folks who have small infractions or people who are currently serving jail time for selling cannabis get some sort of relief. Now, this was just on the campaign trail, okay? His administration is less interested in doing cannabis reforms in the first year, but are open to doing cannabis reforms within President Trump's presidency. What this means is that you can guess it's not a top priority because they don't necessarily see it as so controversial. So they really want to get the hard stuff out of the way first because they know that their time is limited on some of those things with a lot of opposition and the courts trying to limit their power as well. When you want a win, something like cannabis can be won very easily because there is bipartisan support. But Trump will want to take that at a time where he feels like he has done a lot of more losses overall. And this is just a strategy that political insiders rather have when they know that there's a lot of controversy within their actions. The bigger issue is the lives that have been impacted by the previous harms or by the current harms of the war on drugs. It's still here. And while Project 2025 does not address cannabis at all directly, it does address fentanyl in particular being distributed. And the people who were previously blamed for the war on drugs and distributing cannabis and harming communities were Blacks and brown people as well. We're seeing that still, but now with a different type of drug. So my concern is that there is not a holistic approach. I'm not saying that certain groups, are exempt from any type of law or anything like that. What I am saying is that there has to be more of a thoughtful manner to what the past has been and what the current state of affairs is. But of course, he believes that the supply will be cut off at the borders. I'm just hoping that in the future, we don't look at this and say, this is the war on drugs 2.0. Republicans are trying to do rollbacks, not just of cannabis policy, but cannabis social equity legislation. And this is obviously not a great thing because we want to be able to keep social equity at the center, which is why I argued before that right now is probably not the right time for us to jump at cannabis legalization during this presidency. Maybe perhaps when there's another opportunity for Democrats to come to the fore and, put that at the center. But if that is not the case, I really doubt that social equity would ring the bells of the Oval Office, just because the Oval Office has been so adamant about not having diversity, equity, and inclusion at the center of any sort of hiring practices or any sort of advantages. And this is literally correlated to cannabis social equity because Black and Brown individuals have been impacted, but specifically Black individuals have been impacted the most with the war on drugs. So when you're thinking about giving some sort of reforms that could repair the harms done back in the past, race is at the center of that conversation, and so is areas that have been disproportionately impacted by that harm. Think of like Chicago, even DC. But the president has been critical of DC decriminalization. So it's a lot of conflicting views, and I don't think that until President Donald Trump has decided on his cannabis policy with, ideally some sort of repaired harms for people who've been impacted, until that's at the center of his cannabis policy, I don't believe that we should go forward with it. However, that does not mean that we should stop doing any sort of advocacy because our voices always matter. Regardless of what time it is, regardless of who's in the office, regardless of the political climate, it does not mean that we should stop. What it does mean is that a different approach should be made. So while Republicans are looking to just make this strictly about business and maybe have President Donald Trump lean more in towards that, we could be shifting the conversation about how we can make positive inroads and just say, look, this is an opportunity for us to be able to look at what President Donald Trump has not been positive on and see if this is something that we could flip that. But of course, that is a lot of wishing. And of course, that's a lot of hoping with this particular president who is really against anything that has to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion, making it so that even corporations, and corporations even lie into cannabis businesses, those corporations that have diversity hiring practices are liable to investigations by the Department of Justice. The same should be said, and also that same approach is being had by those Republicans in states like Ohio that are looking to repeal that. The president has looked at all the different ways that he feels that white folks have been disadvantaged. And this is one way, if we are prioritizing funding for Black and Brown individuals because of the harms, I'm sure this is one way that folks in the Republican Party could point out that they would not want to go down this path. Although I'm sure everybody can agree that smoking a joint doesn't harm you and should not be a Schedule 1 drug. It is just not a priority for this administration, even if it's a priority for us. What we should focus on right now is our communities and being there for those who are the most affected by all of these different changes on the federal level. And so because of that, I'm sending all my thoughts and prayers to everybody wherever you are and you're thinking about, what is happening and how it's affecting you and your community. Please stay tuned for more resources overall. I'll be sure to provide that for you. But that's where we're at with federal legalization and the Republican agenda. Right now, it is not a priority because Project 2025 did not list out cannabis legalization as one of the, drug reforms that they want to do, but rather fentanyl. And so we have seen that because of that, it could be a good thing for cannabis, but also a bad thing for our communities because it might just be a new drug that has been the priority for one administration, but it's very similar sounding to the first war on drugs that we had with Reagan's administration and even Nixon, who now, as we know, had admitted himself that cannabis is not particularly harmful. Please keep that in mind as you continue to advocate. I will be here hoping that we can all get through this together, but stay tuned, y'all. Season 2, we got more episodes and more conversations just like this. And we're going to be hearing from others and advocates who are doing the work on the ground to see what they're up to and what their thoughts are on all of this as we move forward. Till next time, y'all, stay tuned. Bye and welcome back.